Hi, everyone. So this week, this is Phil Travis, and this week the lesson is going to be on Marxism, Leninism, and social democracy. More broadly speaking, on socialism. And this is really an important topic for Americans because Americans tend to really misunderstand socialism. Americans tend to associate socialism or communism with either revolutionary Marxism or with, Soviet communism. And it's actually a highly diverse form of philosophy and political ideology. And so I wanted to give this presentation to help us to think about the different forms of socialist thought that there are, from ones that are more radical, like revolutionary Marxism or communism, to much more moderate ones, like social democracy, that continue to influence in a very productive way the world today. I'm going to be mentioning Lenin a little bit throughout this presentation. Lenin is the revolutionary figure who more or less founds what becomes the Soviet Union at the end of World War I. In 1917, 1918 particularly. And so when you hear references to Lenin, I'm not talking about the Beatle, John Lennon. I'm talking about V.I. Lenin, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, who is considered in the 20th century the primary architect behind what we begin to call Soviet communism. So that's what that's a reference to.
So Marxism, which of course is really the root basis in terms of the development of the thinking of Lenin, of Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. Marxism, idea, a philosophy founded by, of course, Karl Marx and also his partner, collaborator, Friedrich Engels. Marxism is what you might call revolutionary socialism, and it's not the first of socialist thought. It was influenced by the thinking of utopian socialists. It was influenced also by the thinking of philosophers like Hegel. Marxism is a deterministic theory. It's a deterministic historical theory, really, in which Karl Marx believes that society moves through really several phases, with the ultimate end being communism. So for Marx, effectively, society is evolving and progressing to a future point, and that point being communism. So it's deterministic, meaning that it is, in the view of Marx, it is inevitable that society inevitably moves through monarchical systems into a capitalist system, to a socialist system, to a communist system. This theory was a reaction, obviously coming out in the middle of the 1800s, most notably with the Communist Manifesto, but also in other works like Das Kapital. Marx is writing from the perspective of industrialized England. He's writing really as a reaction to the injustices of capitalism. Capitalism really created a very difficult situation for workers because it eliminated many skilled working positions. It drove wages down for workers. It led to long, hard hours and long weeks. Many workers during the industrial period in England in the 1800s working 6 days a week, 12 to 15-hour days with virtually no pay because of unskilled labor driving wages down. It is kind of the reality of Charles Dickens, of course, the author of The Christmas Carol being the most popular, I suppose. But that's the world Marx was writing against, this kind of exploitive industrial capitalist system in which tremendously powerful people controlled the land and controlled the industry, controlled the means of production, and were able to effectively use wage slaves to create wealth and capital for themselves. So Marx is writing as a reaction to this, and Marx's idea is that capitalism for Marx is something that must happen. It's deterministic. So Marxism, according to a Marxist, monarchy must happen, capitalism must happen, and eventually you evolve to communism. Capitalism, according to Marx, the idea was that capitalism would become so unjust and so exploitive that the proletariat, the working class, would ultimately rise up and in revolution overthrow the capitalists and create a social system of some form or another that would then evolve to a communist system in which there were no social classes and in which such exploitation as was seen in capitalism would be done away with. Marx believes that capitalism fundamentally alienates workers, so meaning that workers historically in the past, a skilled craftsman would build a chair, for example, and he would get a fair price for the chair, and the chair was something he labored with, and the work is something that he puts his kind of soul into, if you will, and he's properly compensated. But according to Marx, with the mechanization of manufacturing and such, with the driving of skills down, workers had become effectively wage slaves and were being forced to mass produce products without products that they were putting their life force into, if you will, without a proper compensation. And so it was this exploitation of the capitalist, the industrial capitalist system of the middle of the 1800s that Karl Marx proposes this idea that he believes is, again, inevitable, that a revolutionary socialist movement will eventually overthrow the capitalist status quo. And of course, it is the ideas of Marx, who is not Russian. It is the idea of Marx, though, that will really influence Lenin the most, and Lenin will use it to create his own idea about communism that is incredibly influential on such thought throughout the 20th century and beyond. Of course, there's other branches of socialism, and one of the more common branches, and this branch was at odds with Marxists and Leninists, was social democracy. Social democracy, sometimes referred to as reform socialism. And reform socialism, these are the movements that create, for example, the British Labour Party in England today. If you know anything about British politics, you'll be familiar with that. The Labour Party is one of the most powerful British political parties, and that was a product ultimately of the reform socialist movement. Reform socialism is very different than Marxism and Leninism in the sense that it's not revolutionary and it's democratic. Leninism, as you'll see, is fundamentally not democratic. But Marxism, I suppose it depends, but with social democracy is generally democratic, and it's based not on revolution overthrowing the capitalist system, but instead it's based on reforming society and reforming a capitalist system by incorporating things like higher wages, better working conditions, shorter hours, so on and so forth. Pretty much all of your developed nations today incorporate, to varying degrees, some form of reform socialism. That's designed to protect the interest of the consumer, protect the interest of the worker within society. And so social democracy, reform socialism is fundamentally democratic and is based on reforming within the system rather than overthrowing it. And this becomes a very popularized movement in the latter 1800s and the early 20th century in Russia, in Germany, in Britain. And it was a movement that was really counter to Marxist movements and Leninist movements that were revolutionary in nature. And so it's important to remember that socialism is not as simple as just Marxism or Leninism. Social democracy is another form, and it was a more kind of moderate style of socialist approach. And then there's, of course, the utopian socialists, yet another form of socialism, particularly in the early and mid 1800s is when you find the most growth in terms of utopian socialist movements. In Russia, of course, the Narodniki, which your reading discusses, was the primary utopian socialist movement. Utopian socialist movements were also, like all socialisms, a reaction to the inequality, the injustice, the exploitation of industrial capitalism. But unlike reform socialists that sought to reform that system, or unlike revolutionary socialists who thought to revolutionary uprise and overthrow the system, groups like the Narodniki believed in effectively withdrawing from that. They believed in agrarian, communal social life, and so it was another very different interpretation of socialism. Leninism contrasts to this highly, because Leninism is, of course, quite industrial in nature. And the Narodniki were a movement that Lenin struggled against. Of course, the Narodniki were also a revolutionary group, and the Narodniki in Russia engaged in sporadic terrorist violence against the Tsarist regime. Remember, in Russia, Russia's led by authoritarian leaders, the Tsars, and they are extreme monarchical power, that authoritarian power that controls a country that is, in many cases, 80, even higher percent illiterate, a country that relies on serfdom, on a feudal style of labor that was fundamentally exploitive for the peasantry. And so groups like the Narodniki, which was kind of almost a sporadic terror movement, sought to retreat from the industrial era, retreat from modernism, and by contrast, Leninism sought to do the opposite. So Leninism versus social democracy, and of course versus the other examples, Leninism Lenin proposes a dictatorship of the people. And now it's an important thing to note that Lenin did not believe that this dictatorship would be permanent. It was meant to be a transition to communism. Leninist philosophy in Russia is it's fair to say rather elitist in a way, because Lenin believed that the people, and remember Russia, large amount of illiteracy, huge amount of peasant servantry or servitude, and so Lenin believed fundamentally that you had to have an educated, politicized, ideological movement, a group of leaders that would lead the country and that would create a dictatorship of the people, or a dictatorship of the proletariat that would lead the country to communism. Leninism was fundamentally not democratic, and undoubtedly that was because of fears on the part of Lenin that, especially in Russia, that because of the nature of the country, that if it was democratic, it would cause the communist movement to lose power at some point, or it would fail to be able to control the direction of the country. Russia was a very different place than the Great Britain that Karl Marx was writing about. It was not an industrialized place, and it was dominated by peasant serf labor. It was effectively a feudal realm. Leninism proposes a strong central authority to temporarily lead the people to an industrial utopian communism. Leninism was fundamentally industrial. Lenin believed that Russia had to become the most modernized, industrialized country, and through this it could lead world communism ultimately. World revolution becomes really a component of Leninism. Leninism becomes a voice of decolonization and becomes fundamentally noted for its critique of imperialism and colonialism. Individuals like Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam were fundamentally influenced by Lenin, far more than Marx. Lenin, because Marx is writing about workers in industrial cities rebelling against the capitalist industrialists. Lenin, he couches his ideas more in terms of freeing the peasant classes from the exploitation of imperialist capitalists. And so Lenin believed you could do this first and then industrialize and modernize, and this would help carry the revolution through. So these are some of the fundamental differences between these different forms of communism. There are utopian communist movements. There are utopian communist movements that believe in peaceful communalism and withdrawing from society. There are other sort of agrarian, anti-modern communist movements like the Narodniki that engaged in terrorist violence against the exploitive czarist regimes in Russia. There are Leninist communists who believe in a dictatorship of the proletariat. They believe that democracy will undermine the communist mission, who speak more to the peasant classes of the world than to the industrialized people. There is Marxism, which was an industrialized, revolutionary socialism that was primarily concerned with the issues of exploitation in the industrial cities of the West. And then, of course, there were social democrats or reform socialists who have continued to influence politics in the world to this day quite significantly, and who believed in reforming the exploitive capitalist system for the best interest of the most people in society by improving working conditions, improving wages, and these types of things, and providing benefits to societies and unemployment compensation and these types of things. So there's quite an array of different types of socialist movements that are in place in Europe and in Russia in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And of course, groups like labor parties, like the Russian Labor Party, for example, were at odds with Leninism, because Leninism was seeking to revolutionarily to launch a revolution and to overthrow the country and establish a non-democratic dictatorship, whereas social democrats and labor parties generally sought to reform the system and create a democracy. They were fundamentally at odds and fundamentally different. And so as Lenin rises to power, particularly during the period in the early 20th century, and of course in World War I, Lenin's rise to power in Russia, and even when he's exiled, comes amid opposition to not only the exploitation of the czarist authoritarian monarch of Russia, but also to other branches of socialism that he thought would undermine the grand plan of creating a communist system. It's important to note, too, that Lenin did not believe in authoritarian leadership for authoritarian's sake. He did not believe that dictatorship should be a permanent thing. He believed it should be a transition. Anyway, the first of several, so I hope you guys like these presentations, and I hope they help. So let's have a great week.